Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the China Conference organized by the SCMP. We are kicking off with the first panel with a very interesting topic that is front and center for many of us, which is disruption, the topic of disruption. And disruption in Southeast Asia and how China can lead and learn. So before we kick it off, let me do a brief introduction of our panelists. Beside me, this handsome gentleman here is Khailee, managing partner at 500 Startups, who oversees the venture capital firm's Southeast Asian investments. And we have Tsai, SCMP chairman and executive vice president at Alibaba Group. And we're very happy to also have Ming, president of Grab, which needs very little introduction here because it started out of a garage in KL a few years back and is now in 8 countries in Southeast Asia, branching out beyond ride-hailing to other local services. And last but not least, we're very happy to have Tsao, founding partner at Gobi Partners, who has been an active investor both in China as well as one of the earliest investors out of China into Southeast Asia. So, why don't we just get started? Ming, I'm going to put you on the spot right at the start. Tell us, which industries or economic activities in Southeast Asia are ripe for disruption? Where are the pain points, so to speak?
Sure. Can everyone hear me? Great. First of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's an honor to be here in front of this audience. For Grab, we started as a for-profit social enterprise, solving the issue of mobility across the region. But for us, mobility means much more than just moving somebody from point A to point B. For us, mobility is around physical mobility, moving people, moving food deliveries, moving last-mile logistic packages. It's also economic mobility, and it's also social mobility. By economic mobility, what we refer to as providing a true platform for our driver partners, our merchant partners, to earn more and save more for their families. And if you look at our platform now, across the region that we operate in, the average incomes for our driver partners is nearly 30% higher than the average in every country. It's also about social mobility. And social mobility for us is really helping individuals like drivers change their mindset. They're no longer working for a company, but they're working for themselves. They've become micro-entrepreneurs in their own right. And so this notion of solving mobility for us is a very deep and a very broad set of challenges that we're solving. Now, how we solve these challenges is by providing them with a platform and the tools to go into business for themselves. These tools may be a platform for earning incomes from driving. It may be a platform to help a restaurant expand their addressable market. It may be a payment system to help reduce the friction of transacting online. It may be financial services, including microloans to our drivers, to our merchants, to our consumers, to help them save more, help them invest into themselves, and help them grow their own businesses. So a very broad set of challenges, but also opportunity for disruption in Southeast Asia.
What is Grab working on right now and in the next few months?
We're working on many, many different things. And key to this has been our partnership philosophy. So if you look at the path that we've been journeying on, after our merger with Uber, we've expanded our Grab as a platform service, which is all around how do we expose the technologies that we've developed internally, how do we expose the rails that we've developed, the infrastructure on payments, on mapping, on ID, on fraud detection, prevention, and exposing those services to other entrepreneurs within Southeast Asia, within China, within the US. So we've been very, very blessed to have announced a partnership with Ping An Good Doctor, where we are extending their healthcare services and consulting platform to Southeast Asia. Yesterday, we announced a strategic partnership with Microsoft, where we'll be leveraging a lot of the machine learning AI tools to really reinvent our platform go very deep into data insights across our entire set of services and provide a much more customized, much more relevant service for our consumers. At the core of our strategy with SoftBank, who's been one of our key partners and supporters over the last few years, is this notion of creating a unicorn farm within Southeast Asia. And if you speak with Son at SoftBank, his vision, one of his visions is taking all of the wonderful unicorns that he has invested into within Vision Fund, bringing them through to Southeast Asia through Grab, through a partnership with Grab. And I think what you'll see over the next 12, 24 months is an explosion of different partnerships, all with a focus around improving service, improving quality for our customers.
Joe, has what Ming just said, does it sound familiar to you? A lot of the conditions in China that Alibaba has gone through over the past years, I mean, are those conditions now, do they exist in Southeast Asia?
Well, yeah, first of all, I'm clearly the guy that didn't get the memo about the dress code. And I think clearly I am definitely not the tech guy, the disruptor here. We're sitting among disruptors here. But I think what Ming is saying is, I agree that there's the conditions in Southeast Asia is something that we've seen before in developing economies like China. And today, I think China, in the China context, we still see a lot of development and a lot of places where improvements need to be made. For example, incomes of delivery people, incomes of drivers, the mobility of certain strata of society. I think China is a little bit further on the curve, but we see similar conditions in Southeast Asia. I think one big difference, though, is that China is a big manufacturing hub. And today, in different Southeast Asian countries, depending on the economy and the culture, there are different parts of Southeast Asia that are strong in manufacturing, other parts that are still catching up. I think that's going to make a very difference when it comes to e-commerce in our business, because in e-commerce, one of the biggest challenges is the source of product and where the products are made. And if in a country where you're trying to do e-commerce and you have to import from other parts of the world, then it becomes a much more challenging proposition. I think the question for Ming is, over time, you really need to look at technology disruption. For example, driverless cars. When that comes in, what happens to the drivers, right? And these are some of the trends that we're looking at, thinking through how we deal with those kinds of problems.
Is there a conflict? I know Grab just signed a big deal with Toyota, and I think part of that is to look, among many things, driverless technology. I mean, how do you communicate that to a lot of your driver partners when, on the one hand, you're telling them you're going to raise your incomes, you're going to make you micro entrepreneurs. On the other hand, you're looking ahead and investing in technology that may come to be widely used and commercialized, such as driverless cars.
Absolutely, and I completely agree with Joe. I think the future of mobility, physical mobility, is changing very, very rapidly. I think part of the, two thoughts to that. The first thought is, within the ride-sharing industry, we do have a strong conviction that autonomous vehicles will ultimately coexist alongside ride-sharing companies, because we have such a large demand of services, while the autonomous vehicle companies are still quite expensive in terms of their unit cost. So marrying the two creates the most effective way to go to market for autonomous vehicles. That's point number one. Point number two is, in Southeast Asia, I think when you look at the weather conditions, the road conditions, ultimately we believe that autonomous will be combined with manned vehicles. As you know, there are torrential rains, torrential storms during half the time, during any single week. And during those periods, it makes much more sense for you to have manned vehicles providing transportation services. When weather is very clear, then of course, augmenting that with autonomous vehicles. So I think there will be a very peaceful coexistence between the two. The third point I would make is, I think ultimately it is important to create a diversity of economic opportunities for our driver partners. So in the one instance, they may be providing physical mobility services, moving people. In other instances, they may be delivering food, which we believe will be largely untouched by autonomous, at least for the foreseeable future. In other instances, they may be providing other services, other value-added services to consumers. So providing a diversity of opportunities for our drivers to earn other forms of incomes is what we believe is the real roadmap for creating sustainable social and economic mobility.
We'll get back to that point in just a moment. I just want to bring in Khailee and Tom here. As investors, when you look at Southeast Asia, what are some of the interesting pockets that you're investing in that may be unique to this region compared to, say, China or the US or Europe?
Well, I guess I'll take a first stab at it. I think the first chapter of like internet investing, we've got a few winners that have become very obvious already. So I guess for venture capitalists who are always like ourselves, who are always investing in what's next, what I like to look at is that in terms of this big umbrella of deep tech, you know, what kind of technologies which actually may flourish better in Southeast Asia versus other places. You know, just to drop some examples, we've recently invested in a company that takes agricultural waste and bond it together with like mycelium technology and sells it as a building materials to Europe. So that company is out in Bandung. It's not even in Jakarta. We've got companies, another company that creates a spirulina production on rooftops out of Thailand with these reactors, right? And it's there because they need a lot of sun and they need a lot of carbon dioxide from buildings. So there are multiple examples where we find innovation at the edges. And I think where these worlds collide, or rather collaborate, would be like when they come to a point where they need to commercialize to the masses to sell spirulina. Hopefully there'll be e-commerce, logistics, platforms, all ready to serve like more people. So all of these products actually get to go. So I would like to invite actually more folks to really think about not just what's very obvious to them in e-commerce and marketplaces, but what's beyond that in deep tech as well.
Tom, are there any sectors that you think could be better left to China?
Yeah, I think my observation is when we first started investing, a lot of it was what we call kind of C2C, you know, copy to China. We were using Silicon Valley as sort of a guidepost. I think one of the big changes now is, you know, what Silicon Valley accomplished in 40 years, China's kind of done that in 20. And I think what's going to happen in Southeast Asia will happen in 10. So I think the cycles are compressing because there's just a lot more information available and a lot of knowledge sharing. So I think that's the first trend. The second one is, again, it used to be copied to China. Now it's China is often setting the innovation standards. A lot of that's now coming into Southeast Asia. So I think Southeast Asia has a real benefit of looking at what's going on in Silicon Valley and also what's going on in China. And I think that gives Southeast Asia this really unique position to leverage both ecosystems. And there's more choices. And I believe more choices is always a good thing. And so when you see a lot of the models that have worked in China, a lot of them are applicable to Southeast Asia. So sometimes I laugh, sometimes I feel like I'm coming from the future just because we saw what's going on in China. A lot of that could work in Southeast Asia, and we've used that as one of our kind of thoughts on how we look at it here.
Can you name a few examples, maybe?
Yeah, so a company here based in Malaysia is a company called Carsum, and they sell used cars. When we were looking at that model, the choice was between that or another company that was doing more of a C2C model. And then based kind of on what worked in China, which is the C to D, a consumer to dealer market, we saw that worked in China, and we thought maybe that would have a better chance than of working in Southeast Asia. And so that's what we did, and the company's doing phenomenally well.
Why don't the Chinese companies themselves export this model to Southeast Asia? I mean, why is it being left to some of the startups here to copy from China and implement it in this region? I mean, is there a reason why? Is the execution difficult?
Yeah, absolutely. I think myself, I relocated from Shanghai after 13 years, and coming to, it's never easy going to a new market. Just like, the U.S. tech companies trying to break into China, it was not easy. I think also for Chinese companies, as you pointed out, coming into Southeast Asia requires local knowledge and real localized experience. And so I think that's the reason why. So there's a lot of opportunities for Southeast Asian startups to take advantage of those.
I guess China has the luxury of coming around later to buy what wins, what works, right? So it's that's a way of market entry.
Yeah, I think the speed of entrepreneurs in Southeast Asia is running faster than what the Chinese companies can set up here. So there are a lot of, it's the entrepreneurs here that are leading the advancement and the innovation. But I do want to say something about the export of a business model. Globally, I think you can count in one hand a few companies that are called platform companies or understood as platform companies. These platform companies are companies that serve hundreds of millions, even billions of consumers. And because they serve so many consumers and they have touches with these consumers with high frequency, then they don't swim in their own swimming lane where they started. They start to branch out into other types of businesses. So you see, Amazon going from e-commerce into entertainment, then they're going to do a lot of other things. And Facebook, Google, the same thing. And I think in China, you can probably find a couple of companies, Alibaba included, that is one such company. We're now doing not just e-commerce, but also entertainment, also providing local services like food delivery, et cetera. We're also in the cloud computing business because we have the core proprietary technology base that enables us to do that. Now, that thinking, the mindset of being a platform company is now being learned into Southeast Asian countries. So if you look at this region, there are several companies that have become platform companies. I would say Grab is one of them. Ming is not only talking about ride sharing. I think today, if you ask you guys, are you a ride sharing company? They would say we're much more than that. They're getting into payment. They're getting into other services, delivering food. And why is that? That's because they today have touch points with millions and millions of consumers that enables them the bandwidth and the capability to expand. I think what needs to be done is really to start focusing on technology and the investment of technology to enable that scaling and expansion.
What's very interesting in this region is compared to the average smartphone in China or the US, the average smartphone in a developing country like Indonesia or Cambodia may have 100 megabytes of memory on the phone. And so when you have 100 megabytes of memory, then what that means is you're only going to install 3 or 4 apps, 3 or 4 platforms. And so if it's going to be 3 or 4 services on your smartphone, they better be the best, and they better have the most broadest array of services. The true platform plays that Joe talked about, I think is very critical for this emerging market, emerging class of consumers.
I think to build on what's being said here, there's another dimension which is unleashing the entrepreneurial renaissance, like the next chapter of it, is that platform companies like Ali and like Grab are also investing in the ecosystem itself. I think with the Alibaba's e-Fellows program, 11 Malaysian companies were part of the inaugural first batch of 36 companies. And I think with Grab Ventures, I think it's been a new excitement and energy into the ecosystem, pledging 250 million for Indonesian companies and so forth, right? So I think the platform companies give back. So it's not just competition of, okay, there's a few big winners, everyone else are losers. I think in this new chapter, everyone's just trying to include everybody else, and so all of us can grow.
I'd just like to bring us back to the theme of this panel, the second part of the theme, where China can lead and learn. Maybe Joe, what areas do you think China can still lead in relation to Southeast Asia tech?
Well, I would say I will focus on the learning part.
All right.
Because from our perspective, where Chinese companies come into this market, what's more important is to understand how to differentiate your products from competition, how to satisfy the customers. And I think there's a lot of learning there in order for us to really get customers to build that customer trust. Lots of local knowledge on the product side. So our approach has been to partner with other companies, local companies. For example, in the area of payments, in every ASEAN country, we have a local joint venture partner. Here in Malaysia, we have a Touch and Go as one of our as our partner for the payments. We have other partners in other parts of ASEAN. So I think that enables us to acquire the knowledge and be able to offer our services better to the consumers. In the areas where we think we can contribute to these markets are a couple of things. One is technology. The second is a little bit of know-how. All right, and I'll talk about technology a little bit. You know, if you look at the core strength of Alibaba, it's really we're really focused on the technology of managing large, massive amounts of data. The entire company, Alibaba, you know, has 2,000 petabytes of data, right? And on a daily basis, over 70% of our data actually gets refreshed. So if you think about that scale, you need to have the technology to not just to capture the data, but also to cleanse the data and make sure that it is stored in a way that could be used, analyzed, and manipulated. So I think that's a core part of the technology where if you look at companies around the globe, only companies that have these types of problems have the incentive to develop the solution. So if you don't have the scale, you won't have the technology. And I think that's an area where Alibaba has, you know, we think a Chinese company with 1.3 billion people with over 800 million internet users will have the scale to develop those proprietary technologies that could be, you know, transported into other markets. I think that's one thing. The other area, for example, is in the area of security, payments in financial services, as well as risk management in financial services. Again, risk management is all about data. How you underwrite certain risks is a statistical exercise, and you need to develop the predictive algorithms to be able to take on risk. The other thing I talked about is know-how, a little bit of know-how. I think in the China market today, just speaking for our own industry, we're no longer doing just e-commerce. We're taking the E out of the word. So we're doing commerce. With a mobile device, the consumer is no longer thinking, I'm buying things on the internet or I'm in a store. Because even when they're in a store, they can use the mobile device to scan, for example, the price label, to compare prices, to look up more product information and things like that. So the insight that we have developed in terms of how to integrate the online and the offline, and what are the pain points, and what are some of the, you know, efficiency gains that you can generate by bringing more digitized technology into physical stores. Those are the insights. There's a little bit of know-how involved that we can share with markets here.
Would you replicate that in Southeast Asia or work with partners to kind of share the know-how, like you said?
Again, it really depends on the local conditions because to serve consumers in e-commerce or in what we call O2O, all sorts of physical services is actually a very, very complex thing. The whole chain of delivering that final proposition to the consumer is very, very long. It involves various different components. And so you have to assess each component to understand whether that's following, that's consistent with local conditions. For example, in our, in the grocery space, in China we have developed a model where when people order online, you can fulfill the order within 30 minutes, and that's because you're fulfilling out of the local store with inventory that's located very close to the consumer, right? That's how you gain the speed, instead of inventory coming from some warehouse in the middle of nowhere. So in the context of here in Southeast Asia, we have to look at the density of the stores, the availability of delivery people that can actually pick up at the store and make the deliveries. And those are all the things that we have to calibrate in order to make it work for consumers.
Do you think it's more complex here in Southeast Asia than, say, in China, in the home market? I mean, I ask this because I've spoken to many people who tell me Indonesia is a country of thousands of islands, with a lot of rural areas. So, I mean, is what Alibaba is doing in terms of new retail, in terms of, getting, in dispersing the kind of logistics to within like maybe a 30-minute radius, is that easier to do in China than perhaps in Southeast Asia, or maybe in Indonesia, you think?
I think there are a lot of, I think for sure Indonesia logistics is a huge challenge, but we find more intra-city volume because it's, when you ship across cities, it becomes a huge challenge, more so than it is the case in China, for example. So there are definitely unique challenges, but I think one thing that's clear to us is when you come to Southeast Asia, it's not just, it's a economy that's, that trade with each other, but it's not a big unified market like what China is. So you really need to take the approach and have the patience to develop your specific model for each country.
I would completely echo that point. And in fact, this region is more than 8, 9, 10 countries. I would segment down further into just hundreds of different, micro areas. And remember, this is a region where there's 4 or 5 different religions. There's many, many different languages. And the need to hyper-localize your service to every single country and region is so critical. A consumer in Singapore is very used to services akin to what you would find in New York or San Francisco. A consumer in Cambodia, very, very different. And so being able to customize and tailor your services to deliver what they ultimately expect, because I think the consumer has different expectations depending on where they are. And so understanding what they expect is very, very important. For many of our drivers in Myanmar and Cambodia, we had to first teach them how to use a smartphone. And then once you then teach them how to use a smartphone, then you can provide a consistent set of services to our consumers. So very, very fragmented. The need to customize and localize and understand the local supply chain, very, very challenging, but critical to understanding the consumer.
But isn't customization or localization kind of contradictory to speed of scaling? Because I would think, you have a platform with the kind of back-end technology. You will want to apply it to as many markets as possible, as quickly as possible. And you gain economies of scale in that way. But you're saying that in Southeast Asia, there is a high degree of localization in many different markets. And many sub-markets, even perhaps in the same country.
Absolutely. I do think it is easier to put on a PowerPoint slide that you will go international and that you will be a regional technology provider compared to actually executing on that vision. For us, we were international from day one. Our first city was in Kuala Lumpur, but our second city, contrary to most companies who would have picked the second city within Malaysia, our number 2 city was in the Philippines, in Manila, because we knew by design, both our organization as well as our product, that being regional was critical in order to really ramp up the scale across this very diverse region. So it is at odds with each other. I would say for companies like ourselves, which has a very heavy offline component to the business, where we have many different touch points with on-the-ground individuals. We now have over 110 million consumers on our platform. That challenge only becomes amplified. And having the right playbook, if you will, but knowing how to customize that playbook for every single country is very, very critical.
I just might want to add, I think one should separate product from technology. I think at the product end, that's what consumers look at. 99% of the consumers will only focus on the product part, and that should be customized. But what enables you to customize is one technology back end. You need to have very unified technology. And the challenge, I think, for most startups, when you go into multiple markets at the same time, is the speed of launching these products. They send separate technology teams to support these products. And then sometime down the road, they will have to unify the technology into one back end. And that's a process that I think every startup goes through. We happen to have the advantage of, having been around for 19 years. So several years ago, we started to unify our technology back end. So today, we can launch products, customize products in different markets in different countries very, very fast because the technology enables us to do that.
Just on the learning part, if I may, I'm curious, are there any examples of things that you learned from operating in Southeast Asia that has been perhaps exported back to China and transplanted into operations there?
Well, I think the learning here is localization, and that's really important in terms of understanding the customer, in terms of understanding the local regulatory framework, and all of that. I think today we're still in the mode of instead of saying that we're taking something from this market and sending it back to China, we're sending our people to this market so that they can learn, and then they can come back to China and contribute with things that they've learned in these markets. So we're sort of right now at a sponge stage, absorbing all the know-how and the knowledge. We're not at the phase where the people can come back and do some things in China that's different.
Let's talk a little bit about jobs, because when we talk about disruption, I think one of the favorite topics is how many jobs are you going to destroy? So how many old jobs are you going to destroy, and how many new jobs you will create? So I'm just wondering, when you talk to regulators about your business, when you want to expand to a new area, there are vested interests, obviously, in transportation, in logistics, basically in every part of the economy. What is your spill to them? Do you say to them that this is net positive? You will create more jobs than it would displace?
Yeah, if you think about our platform and our ecosystem, we have a disproportionately high number of what I would call true working class middle income consumers and working class middle income drivers, and the same for small SMEs and entrepreneurs on our platform. In fact, from day one, we wanted to make sure we were providing the right services for the middle income part of the pyramid, rather than the top 5%, the top 10%, which global companies, particularly from the US, tend to focus on initially when they expand into new markets. So when you think about this category of the population and the demographic, this is the demographic that gets hurt the most from things like trade wars. It's the population that gets hurt the most from rampant inflation, from currency depreciation, and from many things that affect, which arguably folks in this room may not care as much about or may not personally impact their daily lives. So this notion of economic and social mobility is very core to how we think about approaching the markets. It's not enough that we're providing mobility from point A to point B, or we're providing the convenience of food delivery at night when the traffic is so bad that it takes 1 or 2 hours to get to a restaurant. It truly is around how can we create sustainable incomes for this category of the population who would normally not have the same opportunity. One of my favorite stories is Pa Rudy, who was, before he joined Grab, was a construction worker. And he was earning somewhere around $120 a month as a construction worker. Now that he's on Grab, he's able to do a variety of different jobs. He's doubled his income. We've started lending microloans to this individual, so now he's purchased a second motorcycle. He's borrowed to improve his house. And this is all within the notion of how do we create sustainable incomes and livelihoods for a very large swath of the population within Southeast Asia. So as we engage with governments, this is a very core part of what we hope to achieve, because we do believe ultimately the only way to have a very long-term sustainable business is around social sustainability and demonstrating that you are doing a social good for the communities that we operate in.
I want to chime in on this point, in speaking to governments and some folks in the camp of like tech is going to destroy all jobs kind of argument, is there is a fundamental measurement issue about what jobs are. Most economic measures of jobs are formal jobs, formal employment. Southeast Asia is a lot made out of informal employment, and that's pretty hard to measure. So I'll tell you a quick story. My executive assistant, like her friend, wanted to spend more time with her kids. So she stopped being an executive assistant and became a Grab driver. On top of being a Grab driver, she's baking cakes and she's selling it on Instagram, on Facebook, and it's involved in commerce. And she's making more money doing Grab and selling cakes, and she gets to spend time with her kids. But she's not a statistics for the government because she's not in formal employment. She's doing her own thing. So there are millions of stories like this, which is unleashed because of mobility, right, and commerce and payments. But how do we measure that? So one aspect of the argument really is a measurement issue.
That is a great point. And when you see what companies like us are doing, what we're doing is to digitizing the economy, the entire economy, both online and offline. So when you have a digitized economy, things change, but the jobs don't go away. The nature of the job may change. So when we have e-commerce, people are no longer going to the stores. The consumers just get lazier and lazier. What it means is that you actually need to have more service people, delivery people, for example. And so a digitized economy will create more service-oriented jobs. Think about a restaurant. If you can now order online and have food delivered to you, then you need to have delivery people that come to the home. But does that mean nobody will visit restaurants? No. Restaurants will have to remake themselves into when families on weekends they want to go out and have an event or during the middle of the week. They will still go to a restaurant. They think of it as more of a family event. So what that means is that the restaurant gets transformed into more kid-friendly things. And so you have a lot of transformation of the service industry. And also, I think over time, digitization of economies create more service jobs.
Do you think the traditional methods of measuring economic output is capturing this transformation, or are we really behind here?
I'm not a government economist, but I have been involved in conversations where there are attempts in trying to capture some of these things, and I think the nature of digitizing an informal economy actually helps. Because when it's digitized, it's maybe easier to measure. I'm not going all the way to suggest that we start trying to tax that executive assistant story, right? You know what I mean? How do we capture some of those things? But the more digital it is, it's easier to be more transparent, it's easier to measure, it's easier to build a case because we got data. We can use the data to build more insights and build a case for like a broader, more inclusive economy because of digitization. So hopefully we get there.
I think the flip side to measurement of incomes is reducing or lowering your cost of living. And that's the other area where technology platforms like Alibaba, like ourselves, can make a true impact. Particularly in Malaysia, as we work on very specific opportunities to lower the transportation cost for your daily living. These are true effects that trickle into the economy and have a lasting effect on consumers.
Can I just make a point here? I think if we believe that I always read the statistic, which is our kids are going to be doing jobs that haven't been invented yet, right? So if that's the case, then what are the most important natural resources then for a government? Everybody keeps saying, data is the new oil. I totally agree with that. But if the new industries are yet to be created, then the real natural resources of a country are the entrepreneurs that are going to have to go create those new industries. So then, every country's kind of competing with each other to try to create the most value-added jobs. You got to create the conditions to promote that entrepreneurial activity so the entrepreneurs can go create whatever those industries are going to be. I mean, if you think about the impact of an Alibaba or a Grab and the number of jobs that they created for those economies, no economist would have predicted that 20 years ago. So the new industries are yet to be created, and that's hard to measure. So how do governments measure that? What am I doing to promote the next generation of entrepreneurs? Is that education? Is that having good regulatory regimes? It's probably a combination of all. But because you're projecting out 10, 20 years, it's so hard to measure that in the short term.
Should governments get more involved in supporting these entrepreneurs?
Well, let me make a clarification. I don't think governments should be in the business of picking winners.
Right.
Okay? I think that's been proven again and again to not work very well. I think governments have to, create the conditions, right? The infrastructure, the mindset, the culture, open cultural attitudes where the best and the brightest, because in a sense, the world's a little bit out of balance, right? There are folks, we're all here, I would like to think that we're very global in our outlook. We've worked in different cities, we've worked in different countries, and from a business standpoint, you're going to choose the environments that are most favorable. But then there's a large population that, they still think in terms of geographical boundaries. A lot of people, for example, in the US, they still live in the town they were born in, maybe in a 25-mile radius. So their outlook is going to be a lot different. And so I think governments need to, how do you promote that education, that risk-taking attitude, but at the same time realizing that people are going to fail, and you can't be too supportive. How do we create those conditions, I think becomes very important.
I think the definition of an entrepreneur, to Khailee's point, needs to be examined. The definition of an entrepreneur is not just the notion of a Shenzhen entrepreneur or a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, but it's the SME. It's the individual entrepreneur that's creating their own living through different platforms. So today we have 8 million entrepreneurs on our platform. Our mission is to create 100 million entrepreneurs. Not necessarily everyone is doing technology, but really entrepreneurs in the sense of creating their own businesses and SMEs, which are, as you know, the lifeblood of Southeast Asia.
I just wanted to make one concrete suggestion to many governments. In many jurisdictions, there is a difference in tax rate between ordinary income, that's salary income, and capital gains. And understandably, those came from policies of the industrial world where you want to encourage capital formation. So capital is taxed less than the sweat, blood, and tears of labor. And I think in the new world, if you have, if you want to recruit talent and people come in and you grant them stock options, to them, they are taking the same kind of risk as the capital providers because they're foregoing current income for the future. But today, stock options or other forms of stock-based compensation is taxed just like salaries. It's subject to a higher tax rate. And I think if governments can think about that issue of entrepreneurs coming in, taking risk because it's foregone salaries, right? And treat them as though they're investing themselves just like they're investing their capital, it's not just a fairness issue, it's good policy to encourage people to invest themselves as opposed to investing money. So normalizing the tax rates there, that would be a concrete suggestion for a lot of governments to think about.
Yeah, I'd like to extend that suggestion when I'm out in regards to tax. I think a lot of times, especially we're here in Malaysia, right, being maybe the only Malaysian on this panel over here, a lot of times you want to relieve tax for companies, right? So if you're a tech company, okay, you don't pay tax. But what do all tech companies need as a key asset? It's talent. They want to attract more talent, and they want to entice talent to work in the tech startups. So Abu Dhabi, Dubai, these are places where if you go work there as an individual, not as an entrepreneur or a business owner, you work there as an individual, your income is not taxed, right? So you get to keep more of your salary. What if, as a concrete suggestion, what if employees and talents who actually work in tech companies, what if their individual incomes were taxed less or not taxed? Would that attract more smart people who otherwise work in investment banks, in management consulting firms, in large GLCs? Would they flock or maybe be enticed to take on a venture with Grab, with all of these startups, Carson, and all these startups that we funded? So I think there are some of these ideas which hopefully all of us can lead and learn, right, in this China conference together.
I want to leave some time for questions from the audience, but perhaps as we get ready for a Q&A, I could maybe just tap your ideas on obviously the trade war between the US and China, that's front and center for many of us. How is that affecting, maybe I can start with you, Tom, how is that affecting how you see your business of investing in
I think a couple of things. I think it's important to kind of reset the narrative here on the trade deficit. I think you talk about measuring what the trade deficit is. I don't know if many people know this, but I mean, when Nike sells sneakers in China, that actually doesn't show up in the trade deficit figures. And that's about $200 billion worth of products, of American labeled products sold in China. That's actually not captured in the trade deficit. I mean, I think the trade deficit itself is kind of misleading, right? And if you want to level the trade deficit, I think the US administration's taken a rather odd view, because one of the ways to level the trade deficit is to encourage more Chinese students and tourists to go to America and spend money. But at the same time, when you're sort of suggesting that every Chinese student who studies in the US is a spy, it's hard to level that trade deficit. So I think one of the things is we just have to have a clear understanding of what that means. The other thing about the trade deficit is an iPhone that's actually assembled in China, I forget the exact percentage, 80% of that, the components are from Japan, Korea, everywhere else in the world, but that's considered as an export from China to the US, and I forget, the iPhone it accounts for like 20, 30 billion of the trade deficit. So when you look at it that way, then I think, the Honorable C. Wai Leung already mentioned before, the trade deficit isn't really the issue we're dealing with, right? And so if the narrative is, hey, the U.S., maybe is a little concerned about China's rise, and it's high school. I was the big kid on the block. Now you're lifting weights, you're getting bigger too. I feel a little threatened. I don't like that. If that's what it is, let's call a spade instead of using the trade, because I think trade technology. From my standpoint, I think China's been one of the most generous countries in the world. And what do I mean by that? I think when you look at the development of China's tech industry, companies like, and Joe knows this better than I do, companies like Alibaba and Tencent, two of the biggest success stories, it was a collaborative effort. It wasn't just concentrated in China. There were outside VCs, outside tech companies. Ali had Yahoo, Tencent had Naspers, a South African media company that invested into China's tech industry. And so when China's tech industry does well, I mean, the entire world is sort of benefiting. I mean, I've got Alibaba stock in my 401k, right? So when Ali does well, and 40% of Ali's stock is owned by US institutional shareholders. But there's insinuations now from the government saying, oh, you know, these Chinese companies are a tool of the Chinese government. I mean, yeah, I agree with President Trump on one thing. Yeah, that's fake news, right? That's fake news, right? That is absolutely, you know, when Ali does well, Tencent does well, you know, foreign investors are doing well. I mean, that's why I say China is so generous. China is so generous in that the people who made Ali and Tencent so successful cannot actually participate in the equity appreciation of the companies they're spending money on because they're listed overseas. So I think that's one. The other thing is on the trade deficit, if we really want to look at that, you know, right now the US is saying, oh, we're the victim. And yes, jobs have been lost, and I sympathize with those folks. But think about the trade that China did. China had to, you know, lift 500-600 million people out of poverty. And in doing so, they traded kind of manufacturing assembly jobs to do that. What was the environmental cost for the Chinese people? Because a lot of these industries, I mean, textiles, if you've ever been to a textile industry, the amount of dye that they put into the water is really quite frightening. So there was a cost. Right? And now, that's why there's this increasing concern about going green in China, cleaning up the air pollution. A lot of that is because China took on the role of becoming the world's factory, and in a sense, the world outsourced its pollution to China. That environmental cost has never been fully captured, and it cannot be captured in a simple number like the trade deficit. A, because that's a very nuanced argument. And again, a lot of people now, our attention spans are so small that if you can't fit it into a soundbite, nobody wants to listen. But that's when I say that when you look at the Chinese tech industry, it was very open, very collaborative. And again, I know it's been painted as, oh, you know, oh, there's a secret kind of conspiracy. There really isn't, you know? And so for me, how it's affected our business sometimes is, you know, we were based in China, we're coming in, and sometimes people are like, oh, you know, is there going to be technology transfer after you invest in? And the answer is no, there's not.
Well, I think the venture capital industry, on one hand, you'd see it as a little bit more removed from trade wars, right? However, like the trickle-down effects are actually pretty prominent. Here at 500 Startups, we're actually an American firm. We're headquartered in San Francisco. And a lot of our LPs who invest in our funds, they're actually Chinese. We've got Chinese with Japanese capital. We've got a world of capital that's flowed into us. But what if our next fund had 30-40% Chinese ownership? Would the SEC start to knock on our door and want to have more scrutiny? We don't know. Like we have conversations within our partners. Recently we launched an accelerator program in Moscow. And that was hotly debated within our firm. Like I think narrative, you use the word narrative, like there's a narrative that demonizes entire countries. You know, we talk about discrimination, we discriminate entire countries. So would our business be affected by narrative? Because we launched an accelerator program in Moscow, if we increase our activity in Hangzhou and other places in China, would that narrative affect us as an American firm? But we don't even look at ourselves as an American firm, even though we have headquarters over there. We're a global firm, 20 locations, and we think the spirit of entrepreneurship and innovation should rise above this kind of like high school activity, right?
High school. Thank you. Yes.
9 months ago, everybody thought that we're in a trade war. Today, nobody thinks that we're in a trade war. We're in a much bigger war of, I would say it's a Cold War or geopolitical war that's started by the United States. You know, I echo Tom's point. If you counted the profits that are made by American companies and including that into the trade deficit accounting, we could reduce the trade deficit very, very quickly. I think what the United States is doing is reaction to sort of a unfounded fear that China's rise economically somehow is going to threaten the national security and the well-being of the American people. But the fact of the matter is, I think Mr. C.Y. Leung has pointed out, we live in a very, very integrated global economy. The supply chain has no borders, okay? And it's really ill-advised for the United States to launch a war of some sort, like targeting against China, thinking that they could treat China like they treated Russia, isolating the economy and bringing on pain. But today, the world is so integrated that the pain is going to spread all over the world. Everybody is going to feel the pain. China cannot be isolated. The economies are very, very interdependent. The Chinese own lots of US treasuries. So if the Americans want to keep the cost of borrowing low, then they have to think about that issue. I just think that this strategy of attempting to isolate China, right? We looked at the recent Mexico-Canada-US trade agreement. There's a clause in there that effectively isolates a quote-unquote non-market economy that allows countries to opt out of that agreement if they start having bilateral talks with basically China. It doesn't say China, but it says a non-market economy as they define it. And I think this kind of strategy is very ill-advised because at the end of the day, in a globally integrated economy, everybody's going to get hurt.
Can I what Joe said just made me think. Again, how many of you guys are Game of Thrones fans? Anybody? Yeah. I mean, to me, what it sounds like is, I mean, again, I'm from the States, so I can say this, I guess. It seems to me that, you got the Lannisters and Jon Snow here, right? And somebody's the Lannisters, we won't say who, right? And they're still, whereas in reality, the whole world, China and the US need to be working together to fight the real threat, right? The White Walkers, right? Because that's the real, and the White Walkers in this case is really, right? We got some big environmental issues, right? Whether it's climate change, the war on poverty, declaring war on each other when the White Walkers are coming, it just seems kind of pointless. I don't know. Does that make sense?
You got a lot of Game of Thrones fans over here.
Well, that's good. So yeah, Game of Thrones, great, good.
Yeah, and on that note, can I invite any Game of Thrones fans to ask a question, maybe, for our panelists? Please, sir. Yeah, yes. Do we have a mic or maybe?
How loud can you yell?
All right.
My name is Sean Singh. I will be speaking later in the afternoon. I have a feeling, I studied in the US, that my Chinese friends who studied with me at the University of Chicago, they were not spies. They were pretty normal people. The challenge right now is how to make the American people understand. I spent 5 years in US. And most of the Americans, they have very little knowledge about China, the history, the culture, the people. So when I see these few Western journalists sharing kindergarten stories and Cinderella stories, it clearly reflects their poor understanding of the country. So my question is, can Americans ever understand, taking into account that 80% of Americans, they don't have passport, they think US is the world. US is not the world. It is just 325 million people. The total population is 7.4 billion people. So my question is, can we ever make the simple Americans, the myopic Americans, I would say, the shallow personality, will they ever understand China? Thanks.
I want to take that question first because I think about it quite differently. I feel we shouldn't go about life trying to make people be very different. I think the bigger question to ask is that Western media has just been so advanced in storytelling for so many years. All of the movies we've watched as a kid, I grew up in Malaysia, Americans say, hey, your English is great. I said, yeah, because I watched The Simpsons, so I sound like Bart Simpson, right? But that's true. We so much of us soak up American media, Western media has led. So the question is more back to us, is that how do we tell our own stories? Why do we give the power of storytelling to other people's hands? I'm not just talking about Crazy Rich Asians as a hit movie, or Kung Fu Panda. You know what I mean? We need much more than Kung Fu Panda and Crazy Rich Asians. We need Crazy Slumdog Panther, all of that. We need to start telling our own stories. And I guess it's kind of great that there's investment in SCMP from Alibaba to at least have an alternative voice to rebalance some of these things. So I think in conclusion, there's a lot more we can do to tell our own stories.
Thank you for all the cultural references. I think
yeah, I learned from Tom, man. Watch some TV every now and then.
I'm Fiona. I run a startup called 20 Alibaba. I've actually spoken with Khailee as well in another event, but he left before I came. Okay, so the question I wanted to ask was that being in Southeast Asia, and when you decide to invest for each of you, what would be your one main criteria that you look at for a startup? Because I'm sure a lot of people here today in Southeast Asia, everyone's like, well, I'm a startup, everyone's getting funding, but why is it that someone doing similar thing gets funded, the other one doesn't get? No, so what is as you personally, what makes you decide to invest in that startup? Like for us, we are doing cross-border. We are a marketing loyalty platform, so we want to help more brands to sell globally. And then they will always equip us with the bigger boys. So we have to find differentiation as well. So what would be your advice to the startups that we have here in Malaysia and Southeast Asia? Thank you.
Tom, you always turning people down. You go first.
Ouch.
I'm just kidding, man. No, we co-invest a lot. We're friends. Yeah.
I know. Well, now that you put me on the spot here, I think look, I think, again, one is, look, roughly VCs will look at three things. One is obviously the team, the market you're operating in, and what type of technology or differentiation competitive factor. I think all VCs, when you boil it down to, those are kind of the three main factors. I think one of the things I can say what not to do is just because you read a headline in Deal Street Asia, Tech in Asia, like, oh, this company got funded, that must mean it's a good thing. I'm going to go copy and do the same thing. That's usually one of the worst reasons to go do a startup. And I think sometimes you see that a lot in emerging markets. And I remember back in China in the old day, I had this one entrepreneur who just would not let go of me one time. It was about 10 years ago. He's like, I went to a great school. I'm very smart, I will work so hard. How come, how come I can't get funded? And I said, well, what's your idea? He's like, well, I don't have an idea. But if you would tell me the idea, I could go do it. And I said, well, that's just exactly the point. So I really think the key thing is to start with the problem that you're trying to solve. And if that problem really is a pain point for many, many people, then I think you should start from that standpoint. I think too many entrepreneurs often start from the viewpoint of, hey, what can I do to get funded? Whereas they should look at based on their life experience. It's like writing. You got to write about what you know. When you're doing a startup, you also got to, you're creating a company around a problem that you're very familiar with and that you can solve. And I think that's the real interesting thing in Southeast Asia is there's a lot of problems here that are going to be solved by the local entrepreneurs here. It's not going to be entrepreneurs from Silicon Valley, and it's not going to be entrepreneurs from China because they're not intimately aware of what those pain points are.
Thank you. I see Cliff coming on stage.
Passive.
Thank you very much. Please give our panelists a big round of applause.